You've heard it on our show today. Multiple stories on aviation disasters around the world, including one here in Canada. South Korea seeing one of the country's worst aviation disasters. In Kazakhstan, an Azerbaijan Airlines plane was shut down allegedly by Russia.
All right, now another news coming is from the aviation sector, where Air Canada flight 2259 made a dramatic landing at the Halifax Sandfield International Airport in Canada. The incident was reported on the night of 28th of December after a broken landing gear caused the wing to scrape the runway, igniting a fire.
Many uncertainties, as you can imagine, still surround what sadly the aircraft in an aircraft crash in South Korea. I know you've been studying the footage for us, having a look at it all day for us. What are your assessment at this hour?
Well, I'm pretty shocked actually, because whatever happened to the airplane, which meant that the pilot couldn't get the flaps and gear down for the landing, was not actually what caused the death of the passengers. The Transport Minister is quite right. The runway didn't cause this accident. Something happened to the airplane, it disabled it. I think it lost hydraulics. They couldn't get the gear down, overran the runway. It's the wall at the end.
After 3 days of silence, Russian President Vladimir Putin today apologized to Azerbaijan for the Christmas Day crash of a passenger jet over Russian airspace.
Emergency officials in South Korea are now confirming that only 2 of the 181 people on board survived a plane crash. That plane skidded off the runway, crashed, and burst into flames.
Families of passengers on board the plane listened as public health officials read the names of the identified victims in the crash. Loved ones are now demanding answers as to what caused this devastating incident.
This crash happened just after 9 a.m. local time there. You can see where that airport is in the southern part of the country. The flight originated in Bangkok.
Part of an Air Canada flight caught fire, evacuating the plane and closing down the airport for about 90 minutes. What are your thoughts on this?
The aircraft skidded down the runway and part of it caught fire. A passenger on board described the event and said that the plane started to tilt to the left, and as that happened, we heard a loud noise, almost like a crash, as the wing scraped along the pavement. The airline issued a statement and said that the passengers did not seem to suffer any life-threatening injuries, but were quite shaken up.
Well, it looks like this was a de Havilland aircraft that had issues with one of its landing gears. It landed and the aircraft caught fire, but thankfully there were no injuries. At this point, the investigators will be looking at to what exactly happened with this flight, and in particular looking into the landing gear failure. The data will be collected and they'll be looking at the evidence and will determine what exactly happened.
Is this a likely malfunction?
At this point, the investigation is ongoing. It is not clear exactly why the landing gear failed. They'll be looking at the information, the data, and the maintenance history on this aircraft, and will determine the likely cause.
To South Korea now, 179 people are after a plane crash while attempting to land.
And that's what a lot of people are saying. They can't understand why this airplane was landed on that runway at that speed with no flaps, with no gear. There might have been something else involved, but a bird strike on an engine might shut an engine down, but there's so many redundant systems there, it just doesn't make sense. So we're in the dark here, but we know this. The runway is 9,200 feet. It's a very long runway. It did come in hot and high, hot and fast. We don't know why that was. The real issue, that airplane was probably damaged more than we think. And it may not have been just the bird strike. There might have been other things that happened to that airplane. We don't know, but it's very strange to have that airplane land that hot on a runway that's 9,200 feet to the point where it literally was still going pretty strong when it hit that wall.
But it's your understanding that they didn't at all. They had two engine failures, potentially due to bird strike, and then attempted the landing.
Yes, that's correct.
And so there's some speculation that the landing gear may have malfunctioned as well. But in your view, is this just everything happening too quickly for the pilots to react, or how could this have happened?
Well, one of the other critical factors here, Nick, is that the air traffic control data that's sent from the aircraft, it's called ADSB. It's the thing that everybody watches on flight radar. All that data ends up on flight radar and you can see where aircraft are. That was turned off at 900 feet just after the bird strike. Now, when I say turned off, it ceased transmission. So that indicates there were possible multiple electrical failures resulting from this multiple bird strike. So therefore, the pilots were possibly dealing with a cascading series of electrical failures, possibly hydraulic failures. They may not have had a chance if they had a problem with the undercarriage to crank it down, because if they had a dual engine failure, then they would have simply obviously had to land as best they can.
In Kazakhstan, an Azerbaijan Airlines plane was down 38 people. The plane repeatedly tried to make its landing before it diverted and crashed in the country. Russian air defenses were operating in the area. What are the protocols regarding civilian aircrafts near a combat zone?
As investigators comb through the crash site where the passenger plane went down, a stunning statement from the Kremlin today. Russian President Vladimir Putin apologizing, but not taking responsibility for the crash. He says, "In the left arm, I don't know what touched me. I just looked and saw blood." But the conversation cut short. He says, "I have to turn my phone off. They're not allowing me to speak." Several airlines, including those from Azerbaijan, Dubai, and Israel's main carrier El Al, have now suspended flights to Russia.
Stephanie, what is the deal with this?
Hey, Jackie. Yeah, a lot of questions, not too many answers at this point, but speculation is mounting as to what caused this crash in the first place. Now, that source telling Reuters that the plane's communications were paralyzed by electronic warfare systems on the approach into Grozny, but adds no one claims that it was done on purpose, all while Russia's aviation watchdog, they claimed that the plane diverted because of a bird strike.
Being struck by a bird could cause this much of a disaster?
Typically, no. This really happens rarely, this kind of a disaster. Bird strikes do happen around the world, and in particular, the investigators will be looking at as to why the aircraft landed without any landing gear.
Could have had a bird strike in the right engine. Could have had a bird strike in the cockpit window, which actually penetrated the window, even though I don't think the plane was flying fast enough for that to happen, which could account maybe for some cockpit confusion by the flight crew. But this is a bit of an enigma. We have to wait to see what all the data shows.
To the top of the world as global tensions find a new stage in the warming Arctic, with Russia, China, and the U.S. all putting forces on display.
December 1st, NASA launched a rocket into space to study a mysterious area above the North Pole where a gap in the Earth's magnetic field forms at the same time every day. It's leaving us all to wonder, is Santa and his elves, are they going there to hide?
Tonight, the U.S. closely monitoring growing military cooperation between Russia and China in the resource-rich Arctic. Russian and Chinese warships stepping up operations in recent weeks. And bombers from both countries seen patrolling the skies near Alaska in July for the first time. The Arctic now a new point of tensions as the U.S., Russia, and China see new opportunities in a region where rising temperatures have caused the polar ice sheet to recede.
And by the way, the temperature up in the North Pole today expected to be around minus 25 degrees. That is what we call Brita weather.
I like a little bit of cold weather, right? Physics professor and the lead for this mission, Mark Conde, joins us now. Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. This is a very cool phenomenon that happens at the same time every day. Tell us a little bit about what you were seeing and, most importantly, what you're expecting to find out with your research.
Sure. Yeah. Well, good morning. So this is a region of atmosphere. It's not quite above the pole. It's a little bit away from it, and it's on the day side. And it's at very high altitude, about 400 kilometers. And it's a region where spacecraft encounter, just in this small local region every day, an increase in aerodynamic drag that disturbs their orbit. And we don't really understand what allows that to happen, what supports this. It's an increase in density of the atmosphere at high altitudes. We don't really understand what supports it. And the purpose of this mission was to fly through that region and the main sort of core measurement that we tried to make was a measurement of the winds in the vicinity of this region of extra drag to see if there was any perturbation to the winds, but we were also measuring the ionosphere and looking at all of the parameters of the atmosphere to see if we could understand how the interaction between the solar wind and the magnetic field of the Earth allows this region of extra drag to exist.
So, Mark, obviously, you know, we all believe in Santa. Do you think it might be Santa and the elves up there?
It's possibly, you know, as a scientist, you try not to discount any possible things, and Santa would be certainly a possibility. Santa probably doesn't tend to fly at 400 kilometers altitude, although, you know, to try and get around the world quickly, traveling to high altitude gives you less drag, so maybe Santa does get that high. I couldn't say we saw Santa on the mission, but possibly.
It's part of the magic, right? You just have to believe. Now, aside
Absolutely.
from Santa and his elves, what is some of this research going to provide for our life here on Earth?
So the problem is spacecraft operators have to worry about collisions with space debris and with other spacecraft. And for that, they have to be able to predict the orbit of the spacecraft. And if it's passing through this region of extra drag, that changes the orbit a little bit. It messes up the prediction. And so if you can't correctly account for it, then there's more uncertainty in your predictions, and you will have to perhaps execute more orbital maneuvers, collision avoidance maneuvers than you really needed to, because you couldn't correctly account for this particular region. So the hope is that if we can understand what causes it and be able to model it, that will be able to be factored into the models of spacecraft orbits, and so ultimately save spacecraft operators propellant on their spacecraft and allow their spacecraft to stay in orbit for longer because they're better able to account for this anomaly.
Interesting stuff. Well, we will definitely be watching, and we are going to be very excited for the conclusion of this study.
I love mentioning this to people. The North Pole is moving. They go, wait, what? No. Well, we've got the North Pole and the South Pole. And it's not like the North Pole is going to become the South Pole yet. I mean, it has happened before. But we've got the magnetic and the geographic poles. So that's going to be two very different things. Plus, in honor of Black History Month, I'm going to talk about who really discovered the North Pole. First, let's get to that magnetic versus the geographic North Pole. Geographic is always going to be the same, due north, but the magnetic pole can move, and here's the reason why. We've got Earth's inner core, which is solid, but then around it is this liquid metal, and so it's always moving, and so with those shifts, it can tend to move that magnetic pole ever so slightly. So things like GPS and compasses will have to be recalibrated, and things that might be affected is something like the Alaska Northern Lights, which is dominated by the magnetic field. So if that starts to shift, may see a little bit less of that. Now on to who discovered the North Pole. Well, there's controversy on all sorts of spectrums, but one of which is between Robert Peary or Matthew Henson. They were together explorers, Robert Peary, the white navigator, and Matthew Henson, the black one, in honor of Black History Month. Thought I'd bring that to your attention. One of the two may have been the first in 1909.
There's been a lot of talk about the North Pole recently, but did you know that there are two North Poles? The first one is the one that we think about when we refer to Santa Claus and the elves. That is called the geographic north, or the polar north, and that's where the lines of longitude converge. So that is the geographic North Pole. But there's also a magnetic north, and that's where the magnetic field lines converge. So if you look at a compass, that's where a compass is going to point when it points north. It's also constantly changing. You can see how it has moved from 1904 until now. So again, when we talk about Santa Claus and the North Pole, we're talking about the geographic North Pole, but there are two different North Poles technically. Happy holidays, everyone.
The resource-rich Arctic now a new point of tension as the U.S., China, and Russia see new opportunities. In a region where rising temperatures have caused the polar ice sheet to recede, there are now sea lanes and shipping routes opening up. We traveled to Alaska, where U.S. Special Operation teams are preparing for any conflict in the region.
We are with a team of Green Berets as they operate in the Arctic.
We follow them to the closest point to Russia on the American mainland.
Some of the areas where our outstations are at, less than 3 miles away from Russia. So the actions that our personnel and the operations that our personnel are taking on the ground there, they are going to elicit a response in some form or fashion.
This is Polar Dagger, a mission intended to show Russia's decision makers what the U.S. military can do in the remote areas of the Arctic.
Just being in this location, rapidly deploying, rapidly force projecting, is going to cause a reaction that then we can look at for future operations.
But the goal is to keep the Arctic stable and prevent the risk of miscalculation with Russia and China as they increase their operations in the region. Colonel Matthew Tucker says the military's ability to operate here shouldn't be taken as a threat.
The Bering Strait is literally right here. We need to make sure that we have freedom of navigation within the Bering Strait, and so our ability to deploy here and ensure that in a crisis or conflict is something that we need to be able to do on behalf of the nation.